As far as we know, matter and energy can't be created or destroyed, so for all intents and purposes, as far as we're concerned, it's eternal. Now, that may not be true, but it's like what Hawking said. May not be true, but it's like what Hawking said. You can't go back any further, and in everything we know about this universe, matter can't be created or destroyed, so it's, you know, as far as we know, it's indestructible. And we don't know where it began, so in my mind, it's like, why give those attributes to God and then say He produced it? Just say, you know, this stuff, this matter in itself is indestructible and potentially eternal, so, you know, there you go.
You know, I think that a lot of folks are just intimidated by the quantum mechanics label, and it's almost like we have our ideas and we've thought them through, and then somebody kind of says quantum mechanics, and all the rest of us have to lay down and surrender, you know, because, oh, well, quantum mechanics has spoken. And I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to read this and say, or not even read it, just know what Stephen Hawking's view is and say, Stephen Hawking says it, I believe it, that settles it because quantum mechanics is king.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a kind of intimidation factor that the professional scientist can use to silence debate. And I think what the layperson needs to understand is that although the mathematical core of quantum physics, that is to say subatomic physics, the mathematical equations are highly confirmed, well established, but there are at least 10 different physical interpretations of what those equations mean, and nobody knows which of those interpretations is correct. And Hawking and Milodinoff never mention this fact. They just pick one of those interpretations and run with it, and they never bother to mention the fact that nobody really knows if this is the correct interpretation of these equations.
Yeah, well, some of those guys kind of jokingly say that nobody even knows what quantum mechanics itself means. Now, that's got to be an overstatement, but I think it's meant to show how much uncertainty, shall we say indeterminism, there might be with regards to the field itself.
Right. What we need to understand is that the scientific theory is composed of two components. There's the mathematical core. Those are the equations. And then there's the physical interpretation of the equations. And it is the mathematics of quantum mechanics that are well established, well confirmed. But the physical interpretation is, as you say, so obscure that someone like Richard Feynman said nobody really understands quantum physics.
Yeah, and he's a player.
Yeah, exactly. And he's referring there to the physical interpretation. He doesn't mean nobody can do the equations or that it's too hard or anything, but that we don't really understand what the correct physical interpretation of these is.
Okay, so on the one hand, when we hear the quantum mechanics kind of salvo fired against, say theists of some sort, that we ought not be intimidated by that because oftentimes people are misusing the quantum mechanics as if there was an established, accepted way of understanding this that there's no debate about and that we've moved forward in our understanding about the nature of the universe as a result of quantum mechanics.
Yeah, that's right, Greg. And any elementary book, a popular level book that would introduce you to the quantum world or the quantum realm, will talk about these different physical interpretations, and we'll say in the end that nobody really knows which one of these, if any, is correct. And so when people base grand philosophical or theological conclusions on these interpretations, it's very easy to simply respond, well, you know, there are at least 9 other ways of looking at this, and there's no reason to think that your view is the correct one.
Do you think Stephen Hawking is actually trading on a particular understanding of how quantum mechanics cashes itself out in order to make his case for the universe self-creating? And we'll get into some detail about what he means by that. But do you think that...
I don't think that his use of quantum mechanics and a particular interpretation of that is so critical in the origin of the universe, frankly. I think it comes into play more when he wants to get rid of the fine-tuning or explain away the fine-tuning by generating many worlds.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the interpretations, or actually there are a few, of quantum mechanics would be a many worlds interpretation.
I see.
And he appeals to a particular many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics to generate a plurality of universes,
right,
and thereby to multiply your probabilistic resources for getting our finely tuned universe by chance.
Yeah, fair enough. We're talking with William Lane Craig. He is giving us a little tutorial here to understand Stephen Hawking's new book, The Grand Design.
I mean, it's nice to think that there may be some intelligence out there that's guiding everything or that cares, but there's no evidence to support that that's possible or
the guiding and the caring thing. I do think that somehow or another, some type of intelligent design created it.
Okay, and what created that intelligence?
And see, there you go. And that's the sad thing. You're right. You can go backwards and backwards and backwards. So I don't know, man.
On pages 157 to 58 of his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins outlines or summarizes what he calls the central argument of my book. And when you look at this argument, the conclusion to which is, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, it is a patently logically invalid argument. Even if you grant all 6 steps in the argument, the conclusion that God does not exist doesn't even follow logically from the argument. So it's on its face, it's logically invalid. But when you look at the argument more closely, I think it has a number of premises in it that are false. What are these premises? Well, Dawkins says that you cannot infer a designer of the universe based on the complexity in the universe because this raises a further question, namely, who designed the designer? And that therefore this leaves biological complexity unexplained. Now, this argument on Dawkins' part, I think, is quite inept because philosophers of science recognize that in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. Let me give you an example. Suppose archaeologists digging in the earth were to come across artifacts looking like arrowheads and pottery shards and tomahawk heads. It would obviously be justifiable to infer that these artifacts were the products of some lost tribe of people, even if the archaeologists had no idea whatsoever who these people were or how they came to be there. Similarly, if astronauts were to discover a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that these were the products of intelligent design, even if they had no idea whatsoever where this machinery came from or who put it there. You don't have to have an explanation of the explanation in order to recognize that an explanation is the best. And similarly, in the case of biological complexity, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of biological complexity, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. That can be left an open question for future inquiry. So the argument is inept right from the beginning. In fact, when you think about it, if in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you have to have an explanation of the explanation, that leads immediately to an infinite regress. You'd need to have an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on to infinity. You would never have an explanation of anything, which would destroy science. So that Dawkins' principle, if adopted, would actually be completely destructive of science. That's how inept this argument is. So that argument doesn't work. Now, Dawkins goes on to defend the idea that a designer wouldn't be a good explanation because he says the hypothesis of a divine designer is more complex than the world that you're trying to explain. A an explanation has to be simpler than the phenomenon you're trying to explain, and he thinks a divine designer is less simple than the world, the universe involving all this complexity. Well, that is completely mistaken. When you reflect on the idea that God is an immaterial entity, a spirit, he is a mind without a body, then God is a remarkably simple entity because he has no parts. There's no composition in God's being. An unembodied mind is an entity that is startlingly simple in its nature. So what Dawkins is obviously confused is a mind's ideas, which may be very complex, with a mind itself, which is a very simple entity. So insofar as you're interested in simplicity, the hypothesis of a divine designer is certainly an advance in simplicity, for what it's worth, over the unexplained, contingent complexity of the universe with all its diversity and variations. So I think that Dawkins' central argument is just hopeless. It is logically invalid on the face of it, and moreover, it's predicated upon premises that I think are clearly false.